Hello. Sorry about that. Yes, so I wasn't even listening to what Carolyn said, but it was, yes, that's me, I think. So I had who I am here, but I think you know who I am. Today, basically, I'm going to focus on kind of the beginning and the end of my PhD research timeline, which was in itself slightly based on a big film heritage project that I did beginning of last year, using these three towns. So this gang here on the screen, I don't know if you can see really, there's probably about 1,000 people there. They're at the Riviera Gardens Open Air Picture Theatre in Cliftonville in Margate in August 1911. And they're the audience for that night's show. And it was a location quite close to the seafront, so hopefully not too windy. And behind them, there's a temporary kind of perimeter wall, which would have had wooden benches or chairs behind it, a standing room, live music playing during the programme of short films, and possibly acts as part of a cine variety show. And so that's in the town, sort of, about a sort of 120 years ago. So I'm just going to I'm going to skim some of the history because lots of other people have talked about the history. So I'm going to kind of skim it a little bit and really focus on the film. And also just to say that this image and a few of the other images that I'm going to use are all from Kent Archives and from some materials that they have at Margate Museum. So not all of them are credited, as it were. Right, so the three towns, lovely salmon postcard there to give you a map of the area. But just to kind of base us in 1900 and kind of what the upshot is in effect of the three towns. So Margate and Ramsgate both a bit bigger. Margate really kind of came into being via tourism in terms of its kind of impact across places other than itself. But Ramsgate had that maritime and fishing history much more. Broadstairs much smaller in between the two of them, with tourism rising, but on a much smaller scale. But again, fishing as well, and some maritime paths, but all on a much smaller scale. So it's the two larger towns and the one in the middle. But as I say, that's enough on that. A little bit more detail in terms of them at this time. So in terms of social change, in terms of why these towns should have grown, why tourism should have grown so much at the time. Obviously to do with things like labour laws and education reform, which I won't go into now, but ultimately people having time and money that they might not have had before, and this developing a tourism industry via the transport. That's little ad there under transport is from June 1865, so shortly after the train arrived in the area, and that one is particularly advertising day trips. It literally says on it somewhere, no luggage allowed. So this industry is fast, it bursts out as soon as the train arrives. And the postcard next to it is a Broadstairs in 1900. And all three towns, the tourism kind of rose at the same sort of time. So they were looking for everything that a tourist might need for a day or for a longer stay. And just to give you a sense of how the explosion of it really, particularly thinking about Margate, as I say, which was the centre of the tourism in the area. In 1830, about 100,000 visitors would visit by sea. And 100 years later, which in fairness is a long time, but 100 years later in the 1930s, by the 1930s, Margate had 240 hotels, 1,300 boarding houses, and 5,000 other places taking in paying guests. So this whole area has absolutely exploded with with tourism, and so film playing part of that. So again, this is our gang in Margate in August 1911, and I think that film related to this technological innovation in terms of transport and also in terms of popular cultural production at the time, and both together are kind of core to understanding what the first cinema audiences made of early film. Middle-class reformers were less enthusiastic about film and about that popular cultural entertainment, which I'm sure we're aware of, but particularly for film, there's just this great fact that the Times newspaper reported on the very famous Lumiere's first cinematographic show at the Regent Street Polytechnic in February 1896, which was officially the first time film was shown in this country, but actually there were earlier ones. So the Times reported on that in 1896 and did not say another word about film for 8 years, to give a sense of where it sat in terms of the people who read the Times' life, as it were. But anyway, modernity would not be stopped. So what I'm going to talk about now is about some of the people who enthusiastically first brought film to the three towns. Just before that, just quickly give you this quite nice quote from someone called Kevin Reardon, who wrote something about itinerant cinema and moving image of modernism's borders. He said, amid the dusty reels and sensational origin stories of early cinema, these projectionists, technicians, promoters, filmmakers and showmen produce the broader and enduring cinematic imagination, with all its figurative jump cuts, dissolves and montages that informed and still informs modernism. These men were responsible in a very concrete sense for the circulation of modernist objects, ideas and practices across borders. So we're going to go first to Ramsgate in 1897. Here we have George Albert Smith, who's a stage illusionist, a magic lantern lecturer, and Laura Bailey, who was born and brought up in Ramsgate and is by this point a well-known stage actress. And they'd married in 1888 and they lived in Hove. George had moved into projecting film, and this below them is a bioscope projector from the same year. Later that year, George would move into manufacturing his own film equipment and making films. And as one of the key British film pioneers, working with a group in Hove, including Laura, who often produced and often performed in their films, which were made to hire, sell and promote their own camera technology. Laura also knew Mr. Hunter, who ran the amphitheatre, and this is a picture of it. It was just up the high street in Ramsgate. On the inside, it looked a bit like this one, which is actually an amphitheatre in London, but was later owned by Sanger, who owned this one in Ramsgate. The ad, which I'm not sure if you can read much of, but the style of it, the sensation language is much the same. The way it says animated photographs, exclamation mark, the rage of London, exclamation mark. These pictures should be seen by everybody, exclamation mark. So plenty of sensation there. But what was advertised here is the invention, not the film. So cinema itself was the attraction. And there were similar places showing film in Margate and Broadstairs. 2 weeks after that ad, there was a review of this pantomime which had the film in it. And just while I just read you just some words from that, I'm just going to show you some of the films along the types of which they'd have seen. So this is the Serpentine dance from the Edison studios of a famous dancer, Annabelle. There's a whole story about Serpentine dances for another time. And this is Brighton Beach, which the filmmaker is unknown, but is most likely to have been George Smith. And the review in the Thanet Advertiser says, the exhibition of animated photographs given by Mr. George Smith has caught on wonderfully, and certainly to see the pictures alone is well worth the charge for admission. The audience have had before them each evening the photographs replete with the natural bustle and movement of Brighton on a bank holiday, a lady dancing the Serpentine dance, a street fight, cyclists in Hyde Park, the Tsar of all the Russias passing from Paris to Versailles, a train arriving at a railway station, it goes on. Mr. Hunter is to be complimented on his enterprise in placing this latest development of photographic science before the Ramsgate public in such an acceptable way. So other film viewings in Ramsgate to date, in as much as in the preceding 12 months, have been much more educational and scientific. And there's more to be said about literally the content of the films at that time, and how many were in effect kind of actuality and real life, and how narrative developed. But for another time, we're going to move on a decade in Ramsgate. And there's a clip. I'm not sure if you can see it. It's kind of small from where you are. But this is a clip of a film from 1913 called Mabel's Dramatic Career, starring Mabel Normand, who was one of the early queens of silent Hollywood comedy. And she's, you can really not see it, but I'm going to tell you anyway, she's on the right of the screen, within the screen. But what it does do, this clip, gives a picture of what it was like in an early small picture palace, what that experience was like. So in that, you know, the rattle on the whir of the projector would have been really part of the experience. There would have been no kind of secrecy or illusion in terms of where the picture was coming from. Just to say, again, there's an image there of a operator with a bioscope projector. So that would have been in the room with them. And also on the kind of the front right of that clip, you can see there's a pianist there. So So just to link absolutely to your last painting that you showed in yours, here is Ramsgate in about 1900 on the beach. And just to point out these details, so this is, I really don't know how much you can see from there. This is the sea. This is beach, and there is station. So there is about 5 foot between getting off the train and having your toes in the sand, basically. That's all there is. But we are interested in the fact that that is there. It was built in the 1860s, and beyond it is the Granville Marina, which was developed soon afterwards. And at the very end of that, it is a building which opened as part of the development's entertainment. And it opened as the établissement for concerts and dances, and then was renamed the Marina Theatre, and then became the Marina Theatre and Electric Picture Palace in 1908. And we only have pictures from it in the inside later in its life as a ballroom, but on the inside it was quite like this one in Brighton, in terms of a single hall with a stage end and the gallery wrapped around. So it would have been like that. That's where the films would have been shown. And the person looking after the films was very different from George Smith and Laura Bailey. He had this brilliant name of William Joseph Attack, as in literally to attack. And he was also the manager of the Cinema Lawn, which was an outdoor cinema. And this ad is from the same month as that crowd we saw at the beginning, just up the coast in Cliftonville. So he was, this ad references a couple of things just to point out. One of them is that it says that the pictures are acknowledged to be the brightest, steadiest and clearest ever seen, which gives a sense of what other shows might have been like, with a fading projector lamp, jumpy picture and worn or scratched reels. It also references twice weekly changing of pictures, in as much as, like now really, the industry required audiences to cultivate cinema going as a regular social activity, and to view them once, dispose of them, and then wait for the next not dissimilar thing the next week. In William Attack's memoirs, he notes that him and his wife had 6 children. One son worked with him on turning the projector handle very carefully to maintain lifelike appearance. And during the changeover from reel to reel, he had variety acts to fill in the time, one of which was 2 of his children. And their act was called Tiny and Might. And they appeared at the Electric Palace and then in halls across the country. So what we know of William's life really shows him ushering in modernity at every opportunity, as Reardon noted, responsible in a very concrete sense for the circulation of modernist objects, ideas and practices across borders. Again, without going into the detail of literally the content of those films, it's kind of a bigger idea. And just to kind of give a sense of how William kind of fits in. So here all we have, I don't have no image of him, just literally have his name on that thing. So he's born in 1862, and 30 years later, film arrives. And then, just like George Smith, he had got his own projector, started showing his family films at home in the cellar, and then set up as a travelling projectionist. His first cinema was in Yorkshire, and then, for reasons unknown, he found his way to Ramsgate, sorry, and then the Electric Picture Palace. So there's that one, and then the Cinema Lawn, as we've seen already. Then he moved to another cinema in the town, which was actually part of the amphitheatre, which by the time he arrived at it was no longer that amphitheatre space. It had been remodeled inside and was showing films on a regular basis. And he was there during the First World War, when there were quite often less actors around because they couldn't make it to Ramsgate. So fortunately, film was quite a handy thing to have to hand during the war years. Then he moved on to another cinema in Ramsgate, the Ramsgate Picture House, which was the town's first official cinema. Then to 2 other converted spaces, which had been converted at the beginning of the beginning of cinemas in the town, but this is pre the sound era. And then he finishes in Ramsgate, and for reasons again unknown, he's in Hounslow, and his last hurrah as a cinema operator was at the Regent Picture House there, which he left in the late 20s at the point when they converted to sound. So he ushered in modernity until he retired as the talkies arrived. So he really was a person that made sense within that period. But we're going to skip forward now 90 years. Sorry, can I just, how long have I got? 5 minutes-ish? Okay, sorry. So back to this, again, not going to talk too much about this. Here's the towns now in Technicolor, woohoo. But just the numbers now, just to show what difference there has been in this 90 years in terms of numbers, or 90 plus years in numbers. So the populations of Margate and Ramsgate have both increased. The population, the resident population of Broadstairs is far greater increase than that one. It has become a town which is, it's kind of filled in the space between what was a inland town called St. Peter's and the town itself, and all that space has kind of filled in and become increased the permanent residents. But the actual industries of the towns, in addition to tourism, which is still the key industry, have changed, particularly for Margate, for the creative sector. But yeah, won't go too much into that. But just also to say, in terms of social change for the kind of 20 years I'm just going to talk about now, for cinemas at this end, that at the beginning of the 2000s, all three towns were feeling the effects of decades of sort of underinvestment, following from the 60s onwards, a kind of a massive downturn in the tourism industry, owing largely to at the beginning to package holidays abroad. And that just created basically over sort of 40 years of reduced investment to the late 90s to around the year 2000. Things were, you know, pretty rough, particularly in Margate, which had been so reliant on that single industry. And at the point of the 60s when things started going downhill, the average visitor numbers to Margate were literally 30 million people a year in the 1960s, and that just went down to, in effect, next to nothing within sort of 30 years. So the two pictures that I've got for social change are actually from two films which are set in Margate in 2000 and 2006, which basically kind of made use of the fact that Margate had almost become a kind of a shorthand for kind of a desperate end-of-line location, which is so grim. They're both sort of great films in their own way. One, Last Resort by Pawlikowski, and the other one, Exodus, both of which kind of use the space as somewhere of kind of desperate end-of-lineness, as I say. But the key thing, I mean, all of us will probably know literally those platforms at St Pancras, if you can see it. So the 2009 was the High Speed 1 arrival, which obviously was another massive train moment for this area of the world, and had a big impact. And in terms of tourism, there's a, you know, this, I don't know if you can read this headline from 2015 from the Standard. I mean, it's like a shooting fish in the barrel sort of headline in terms of hipster holidays and bearded creatives and all that. But it, just to give a sense of how that was kind of building up by 2015, it was fast. And obviously regeneration's first cousin is gentrification, which has come up in different ways with different people. So I won't go into that. We'll just say that in terms of tourists becoming residents, this kind of changes the feel of the space. In terms of film, in the 90 years that we've skipped, more than 20 purpose-built cinemas and converted halls have provided residence for tourists in the three towns. By the early 2000s, only 3 were left, and now there's only 1. So now it's a risky investment for a cinema chain. You know, so you might think someone like Picture House or Everyman or something like that or Curzon might move in, because it's still quite a fragile local economy. And also in terms of, again, I think it was Bob mentioned that thing about living in a town that's 50% sea. In terms of a business investment, they call it a 180 territory, that you can't have a cinema in the, you know, like the Curzon here, in the middle of the town, you have that 360 reach. Whereas if you have a seaside cinema, you've just got that. You've only got, in effect, half of it. Even if you've got big numbers and you've got big tourist numbers, it's not the same. So it's a risk. It's that, you know, people have not invested in putting new cinemas together in the last 30 years for clear business reasons. So instead of cinemas, largely there are small niche spaces, many of them catering to the newer DFL arrivals, although some are broader. This is just an image here of one of the outdoor ones I'm going to come back to later. Just going to give you, I was going to give you a quick quote, but I'm going to skip that actually. So let's just go back to, in effect, the end of the analog age. This is moving pictures in Margate in the 2000s. This jumpy video from 2002 is on YouTube, and it's one of these great lovingly made videos made between the 70s and sort of the 2000s by fellas who loved cinemas, and the cinemas were dying, and they knew that. And so they either went in the cinemas last years and interviewed the projectionist and, you know, did incredible, as you'll see with this, incredibly detailed pictures of, you know, making sure they got a shot of every switch, as it were. Or they literally shot film when the cinema had closed down. There's some really nice stuff on Screen Archive Southeast website if you are interested in looking at old cinemas. The assistant projectionist and the top there, who's in this interview, is Wayne, and we'll come back to him. The relief projectionist below him there is Laurie, who was first at Dreamland Cinema in 1949 for a short stint as fifth projectionist. And he was the rewind boy, and that was when they only had one screen. So they had 5 projectionists working there with one screen. But in 1973, which that this image is from 2000, 1973, the building was split, and downstairs, I'm sorry, you just can't see it really, but downstairs, this is the bottom of the auditorium. Downstairs is a bingo hall, and the upper space, in effect, what had been just air, a new floor put in, and they created 2 auditoria upstairs with about 300 seats. And just before we whiz on, just to get a sense of what this was converted out of, what happened in those 90 years, obviously Dreamland is a massive kind of landmark cinema in many ways. So just have a quick look at it. So this is what it's like when it first arrived. So what they've done basically is that bingo hall is from across there basically. And when they made Empire of Light, that is the bit that they kind of renovated to look like an auditorium. And above that is the 2 auditoria above. So at the point that Wayne is being interviewed here, this is 2002, so it's 5 years away from the cinema closing. But just to compare Wayne's life, Wayne's world, to William's that we looked at earlier, that Wayne basically, he had, unlike William, who'd grown up with magic lanterns and travelled as an itinerant projectionist when there was no such thing as a cinema, for Wayne, his world was his local cinema from the start, and it really sort of gave him a life in effect. So as a child, his dad went to Saturday morning pictures at Dreamland. Then in the 80s, his mum started working there as a manageress. Later in the 80s, he started working as an apprentice to the chief projectionist there. In the early 90s, the new owner, the Benbon brothers, didn't allow families to work together. That wasn't a problem for Wayne because there were other cinemas around. So he just went to work in another one in Broadstairs. And that one in Broadstairs, the owner of that also owned another couple of places nearby, which was very common for the industry at that time, for people to have a stake in one or more venues locally. Later 90s, Wayne went back to Dreamland when another outfit took over, and they also owned another cinema nearby. But then 1st of November 2007, Dreamland closes. Dreamland had never digitized or thought about digitizing, and this is the point when this country kind of led Europe in being one of the countries that digitized fastest across all its cinemas. Literally 2 weeks after Dreamland closed, the fully digital 10-screen View opened 3 miles away in the Ashtown Shopping Centre, and 2 years later, the HS1 arrived. So, and that is kind of just where I, just to finish off, come into the picture. So in terms of moving pictures, at the moment, this is the Palace Cinema in Broadstairs, which began as a hall in 1910 and was converted into a full-time cinema in the mid-60s. And me and my husband are the 4th owners, and we've been there since 2016. So how does what we do compare to William and Wayne's? I mean, unlike Wayne, we don't focus very specifically and in incredible detail and precision on one craft and one area of expertise, because projection in that way is now a rare form. People still do it, but it's rare. But like William, we're kind of doing it all in a kind of, we're the sort of manager, we're professional, we're craftsperson, we're unskilled, all of those things in a traditional and digital age kind of mix up. Also, we are DFLs. That makes a difference. You know, we arrived, these kind of white, middle class, middle-aged media industry professionals. And before us, it was a different kind of cinema worker, as I say. They were lifelong local workers who had worked as managers or in lots of different ways. People before us had been front of house people. The 2 people before us had been cinema organ players, cinema managers, projectionists, and various other roles in multiple cinemas nearby for years before they took on the Palace, or indeed the Windsor as it was, and they took it on and they renamed it the Palace. And just to end on saying that Margate has no cinema, but it does have smaller spaces, screening back catalogue kind of indie classics. And these are just a couple of examples. It has an outdoor cinema in the summer in Cliftonville and the 101 Social Club in Cliftonville, both of these in Cliftonville, which are in effect the kind of more hipster end of town. And so those are places you can go, but those are very, the Clifton Way Outdoor Cinema, it's 4 screenings a year, and the Social Club is much more regular film club, but again, it's for a much smaller audience, and the way that their licenses work and the way that they draw their audience is very different from a cinema. So, and just to finish on Ramsgate has no cinema. The last one closed at the first COVID lockdown. But the charity running this is Ramsgate Community Cinema, which opened in January, and it's a converted shop, and it's run by an education charity. It only has the building for 9 months. What they're hoping to do is to buy an empty building nearby for a permanent cinema education space. And that building they want to buy is a former shop, which was built in 1960 on the site of Ramsgate's grand old amphitheatre, which we began with. So we've become full circle. And that's back to the beginning. Thank you very much.